Well, now is the time to start our general meeting. We want everybody to know about our group. All right, so we are the Chicago Archaeological Society. And let me just get up my notes here. All right, so the Archaeological Society, the past for the future. Our group has been hosting meetings for nearly a century, according to our oral traditions passed down by longtime members. We are a chapter of the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. Uh, our group, Chicago Archaeological Society, CAS, is dedicated to exploring the humanity of the human experience, while CAS is focused on covering the understanding humanity's past. The IAAA, the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, works to inform the public about the rich archaeological heritage of Illinois and the Midwest. We hope that you will become a member of our group or renew your membership. As a member, you will receive the Codex, our monthly newsletter, and Illinois Antiquity, which publishes the IAAA publication Illinois Antiquity, which publishes several editions per year, all about the Midwest history and archaeology. But today, we are going to be talking to Dr. Christopher Schwartz. Uh, he is a City of Phoenix archaeologist who works at Sudovaki. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, formerly known as Pueblo Grande. He holds a visiting faculty appointment at the Arizona State University. He has his PhD from Arizona University. He is the leading editor of University of Arizona's press volume Birds and the Sun, Macaws and People in U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest. Please, everyone, welcome Dr. Schwartz to our group today.
Thank you so much, Ray. It's really exciting to be here and chatting with all of you. Just before I get going, can everyone hear me okay? And is everything coming through? Okay,
Sounds
great. I'm
great.
seeing a lot of thumbs up. Perfect. I'm going to share my screen real fast and then hopefully we'll be good to go. There's the presentation that I want down here. Great. And you should now see the presentation itself. Perfect. Okay, seeing more thumbs up, which is great. Okay, cool. Then let us get going. Thank you so much, everyone. It is really exciting to be here today. I think I was invited to join you maybe a year ago, so this is probably the longest I've got to build excitement for a talk, in certainly in the talks that I have given. So I'm really excited about it. Got to spend a lot of time editing some things and tweaking some things as a version of a presentation actually that Ben Nelson and I prepared, I think now probably more than, I don't know, 10 years ago. And it's kind of built on I think it was an OSHA lifelong learning course that we had put together to talk about Hohokam archaeology and the external relations, right? People trade and exchange and what those might mean for the broader relations of people living in the Phoenix area. So I'm going to draw a lot on the Phoenix area and talk a little bit more about the extensive connections to other places right to the south and in Mesoamerica and West Mexico a little bit. Um, that said, it's kind of an overview, a broad overview. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail on a lot of these different ideas, but I want to give you a broad overview on some of the theoretical perspectives and ways of thinking about this and material evidence that have been using as archaeologists to explore this in greater detail. So I was hearing people chatting a little bit about different versions of the talk, so that they've given to other audiences, and I'm excited to hear a little bit more about that, perhaps in the questions at the end. I also want to say who I am. I am the city archaeologist for the city of Phoenix. I work at Sudovaki Museum, um, formerly Pueblo Grande. So hopefully there's some folks on the call who have been to the museum and have an idea of where that is and what that all means. So my work, I think, on a day-to-day basis is somewhere between cultural resource management or cultural compliance for the city and people working within the city, including cultural resource management firms, as well as city project managers and folks within the city, and archaeological research, right? Working out of the museum, working with some of the collections that we have at the museum. and pushing forward some larger archaeological projects that we have been working on. And so I hope, I'm kind of in the early stages of some of those which are actually related to long distance exchange in the past and trying to better understand that. So I'll chat a little bit more about those as we're getting in there. Uh, I have worked for years with Ben Nelson and Jose Luis Punzo on a project called the Connections Research Project. And this project it has been aimed at looking at material connections between people living in the US Southwest and Mexican Northwest, and then all the way south to West Mexico, Mesoamerica, and importantly, the space in between, right? I think we talk a lot about, perhaps by necessity, even I do, right, in the presentation you're about to see, about objects that came from quote unquote Mesoamerica and into the Southwest, and the truth is that that leaves a lot of area in between, right? Where exactly did they come from? Where were these objects found initially, and how did they get there, right? How can we fill that in with experiences and the daily experiences that people had, and what that might have meant for how they were living their lives, kind of on a daily basis. So our work has really been documenting instances of what we call non-local, interaction markers of interaction between these larger regions, and and so we've been doing that for, the broader Southwest, and to the south as well, parts of Mesoamerica and West Mexico. And we're really interested now, I think, in fine-tuning that a little bit and working on Sonora and Chihuahua and some of the states in between, Mexican states in between, and areas that haven't perhaps been as well represented in some of the talks that have been given, or in some of the work that's been done in the past. So my work personally has been focused on scarlet macaws as part of this, right, as one element of those different things. And so you'll hear a little bit about that today, as well as some of the larger context that we're working in. So without any further ado, let's get started. So, exchange is a fundamental human behavior, right? People have always exchanged ideas, material objects, etc. Normally when we start talking about this, I'll say that today we take for granted that globalization has made it really easy to exchange goods, ourselves, our words, and our faces over hundreds of thousands of miles really instantaneously. But of course, I don't have to tell you all that, right? I'm here via Zoom. So, but we know that people in the past really did not have that luxury. And long distance exchange required the mobilization of resources and human labor across really vast networks of interaction. And the amount of effort required to create and maintain these networks suggests that the things that move through these networks were pretty valuable to people. And for that reason, distantly traded or transported objects can tell us a lot about the people who were moving those objects, right? And specifically, I've been particularly interested in the social, economic, and the political conditions that motivated people to move objects over these very, very long distances. I took one tack at that by looking at placemaking in my dissertation research and some of the work that followed. But there are many different associations with social processes of aggregation, differentiation, social differentiation, that we know that objects that were transported over long distances that are non-local and exotic would have had in different places at different times. So one of the central questions that have really motivated the work that I've done on this topic has been, how did acquiring and circulating these rare and non-local objects and materials bring authority and standing to people? And then how are these objects interpreted in local context, right? We know that they came from somewhere else into a new place. Do they become reinterpreted? Do we bring with these objects the entirety of the ideas that would have surrounded them in one location and totally uproot that into a new location? How does that change, and what does that tell us about those new local contexts where these objects have been found? So, long distance exchange, and specifically looking at the Phoenix area, is really not a new question. There are, and I should have probably pulled up these different book volumes because we've been having some more recent talks about them. But there have been a handful of really incredible edited volumes that have been put together just tackling these ideas, right? Not specifically focused necessarily on the Phoenix Basin, but covering long distance exchange and interaction, and the movement of materials and objects and people. And I think the Phoenix Basin is a particularly good case study, because of the extensive connections that we have seen, from people, or that appear, that people had living in this area. And I want to state from the outset, right, that I'm talking about the Phoenix Basin. I'm talking about an archaeological tradition that archaeologists call Hohokam. And the term Hohokam is actually referring specifically to this archaeological tradition, right, of people that constructed ball courts that created red on buff pottery, that lived in the Phoenix and Tucson basins and areas to the south, that built platform mounds later in time, and so on and so forth. And this is different from the word huhukam, meant to, which is an Otham term to refer to the ancestors, people who have come before them. And what we're really talking about, I think, right, is ancestral O'odham and Peepash people, right, who continue to live in the Phoenix area, and whom we can draw, I think, really interesting, a much solid and more holistic understanding from by talking to about these ideas, which I'll get into in sort of our first case study here, looking at ball courts. Um, so this area of Phoenix and Tucson, what we call the HOCOM areas, archaeologists has instances of ideas, materials, and objects that are particularly well connected to West Mexico, specifically, and has actually been called the northernmost extension of Sonora and Sinaloa. And I'm showing an image just to get a real brief and quick idea, right, from Randy McGuire and Elisa Villalpando, that shows similarities, right, between these quartered ceramic vessels that you see in Alta Vista, Zacatecas, in Guanajuato, and the Snaketown site, right, in Phoenix, which I'm going to show images of in the past, right. So we have interesting connections, red on buff pottery, and specifically this way of producing pots in this quartered style is one of those ways. And actually, our understanding of what we call Hohokam has been really informed by connections, external connections to Mesoamerica. And Emil Howry, right, who put together or worked to put together the chronology that we have for the Phoenix Basin and Tucson basins, right here that you can see on the left side of the screen, the pioneer, colonial, sedentary, and classic periods, describes a pioneering group of Mesoamerican Pochteca elites, tradespeople that came up into Phoenix and settled a colony during the colonial period, where they put down roots in the sedentary period, began constructing these really expansive canal systems, and then experienced the classic period fluorescence, where the canal systems expanded to their largest extent, right, and started producing platform mounds and these very expansive sites, and that was, for years, and whether we're doing it intentionally or not, right, we still are relying on this migration hypothesis. That really couldn't be further from the truth, right? We certainly today have some understanding that people had connections with people to the south, but the truth of it is that and some really good archaeologists have been working on this for a really long time, right, to establish that what you see, those developments in the Phoenix area, are actually completely in situ developments, right? People working together to produce this incredible canal system, and the terminology itself as well, right, is a bit of a misnomer. What we end up seeing is that in this pre-classic period, between the pioneer and sedentary, we do see kind of this flourishing of distant connections. You see the expansion of a regional ball court system, perhaps drawing influence, right, from the one that we see throughout Mesoamerica, that may again be associated with markets where people were trading, especially red on buff pottery, a lot of local specialization in its production. You see the expansion of irrigation systems in the area as well, and sites growing in size, and then in the classic period, what we actually see, right, is a really expansive population aggregation, people moving into the Phoenix area, and then a massive depopulation of the region as that growth became unsustainable for various different reasons. And Dave Abbott has a really wonderful volume that kind of tackles this, specifically looking at canal system too. So a lot of what's influenced this thinking, right, and how we understand um, Hohokam, especially in these earlier days, was the Mesoamerican ball game, right? And this is, I think folks are pretty familiar with the ball game. Dates as early as 1650 BCE in the Maya region, right? And you have a playing surface with large mounds, and over time, right, it goes from being kind of more of a what you're seeing at the top, much more simplistic, into this really formally established eye-shaped ball court. And you see these ball courts like proliferate all throughout Mesoamerica. They're very well known, well studied. People have focused a lot of time thinking about it. We have all kinds of different evidence indicating, right, that people were playing this ball game, including the balls themselves, images of ball court or ball game players. It was played for over 2,000 years. And it was played differently in different times and places, right? And not always exactly the same game. And you can imagine, right, if you're playing for 2,000 years, there's gonna be some variation over time, as there would be with any sport. Um, really importantly, right, there's a strongly ritual and political focus of the game that is involving regeneration of life and the maintenance of the cosmic order. And again, the Popol Vuh, the origin narrative of the Maya, implicates the ball game as a contest between heroic mortals and the underworld deities that plays out the creation of the known universe. And I love to show some different images of different ball courts in different places because it's always really fun to see. Here's examples from Copan and Quintana Roo at Coba, Cajalpech all the way down south in Belize, right? Different variations. Here's one Chichen Itza, Monte Alban, really well-known Mesoamerican sites. Cantona, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Cantona. It's a really incredible site in Puebla. And here's an example from La Quemada as we're moving ourselves north. And at Paquimé in Chihuahua, in Mexico, people might be familiar with the site of Paquimé, really kind of eye-shaped, but really blurring, I think, kind of the boundaries between an eye-shaped and then a more, what we understand as more Hohokam style ball court. Um, and again, like I was mentioning before, this game is also played up into the Southwest, believed to be influenced by Mesoamerican people, but the Hohokam certainly seem to have developed their own version of the game. We have at least one example of a rubber ball that again people may have been using to play with. And even though people have theorized different kinds of functions for the game, there's no clear, obvious, I think, consensus about exactly what people were doing on these courts, right? Um, People have just obviously you could be playing some version of a ball game, and some of the earliest or early people, often people who were working with Howery at Snaketown, actually hypothesized that these were dancing courts, that people were dancing there. And this is something that I think most Southwestern, Northwest Mexican archaeologists would probably argue that some form of ball game was played. But I think that there could be various different functions, right? Dave Abbott has also talked about markets, that marketplaces may have been established, coordinated with the playing of the ball game, right? So these are really important social events with various different kinds of functions, including providing formal and ritual context for exchange between people, facilitating integration within and across communities, right? Reinforcing social control, or people working together for social control through community leaders, or perhaps also, right, the reenactment of cosmology as we see throughout Mesoamerica. So what we find in looking at these ball courts, right, is that they're certainly much less formal than the ones that you see in Mexico. Lots of earthen. They're entirely earthen, almost entirely, I should say. Not most of them are not masonry ball courts. They're oval shaped rather than eye shaped, and ranging in size from 50 to 80 feet um, to 100 by 200 feet, right? So they can have pretty serious variation in their sizing, and up to 194 known courts, with the furthest north being at Wapatki in the Flagstaff area. And you can see the expansion or the extension of this ball court system on at the right of the screen here. And so here's an example of the Snaketown ball court, which could have fit up to 500 people, right, watching from the sides. And this was half excavated, so you only see the front half of it. And you can see it continues into the back half. And here's what it looks like today, actually. I was just out there. I was really lucky to be brought out with Kyle Woodson and Chris Lohendorf and Linda Morgan to go take a look. And here's what it looks like today. Clearly, is kind of built up some sediment and things like that over time. And this is the smaller Snaketown ball court. So there's another court slightly to the east of where the larger one is located, right as you're entering the site from the east. Here's what it looks like from above, right? And you can see, let me see if I can get my mouse up there. You can see the smaller ball court right here, series of different mounds extending outward. And then this is the larger ball court that was half excavated just over here. And then we see other examples of Hohokam ball court villages throughout the Southwest, right? Here are a couple different examples that you can find on the Desert Archaeology website. One near Florence, Arizona on the left, the other near Gila Bend, and another, an unexcavated ball court at Casa Grande. So they reach their maximum extent in the sedentary period. And around 1080, thereabouts, ball courts began to be, or 1100, the ball courts began to be fall into disuse, right? People stopped using the ball courts. Um, and again, we've talked a lot about what their purpose is. They center in the Phoenix Basin. There doesn't really seem to be a central site or a building, unlike you might see in like the Chaco larger network, and they follow the same distribution as red on buff pottery. And so this is interesting. When we were out there, we were talking to folks from the Gila River Indian community about this, and I brought up, kind of trying to understand a little bit better, this interpretation that the courts had been seen as dance areas or dance arenas by some of the informants that Howery was working with when they were first excavating, and the folks I talked to really maintained that the ball game was played in these courts, right? That a form of the ball game was played and had always been played for many, many years, right? Predating the construction of these courts, right? So this is something that people really seem to have internalized and have been playing for a very, very long time. And so I was really interested to have that conversation and hear a little bit more. So I showed an image of the ball court at Pocky May, and I want to talk a little bit too about the site of Pocky May because it is also an incredible example an important example, I should say, of long distance exchange and understanding um, how people were interacting with people in the past in that way. So the site of Pocky May was inhabited between 1200 and 1450 CE, right? It's this 1,000 to 2,000 room Pueblo style settlement in Casas Grandes, northwestern Chihuahua. And it's particularly interesting because you see the merging of really traditional Southwest and Mesoamerican architectural styles. I showed the ball court already, but you also see these large compound kind of room blocks that kind of merge these different styles. There's platform mounds and things like that throughout the site, and effigy mounds and things that you maybe associate with people from the South, as well as material culture from the South, from all over, parts of Mesoamerica and West Mexico. And it was long considered this regional exchange center that objects and materials were coming to Paquimé and then dispersing northward into the southwest. And this is something I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit more and challenge, certainly based on the recent research that people have been doing at the site. Um, but it's important to know, right, that there are these immense collections of rare and exotic materials. And one of the incredible examples from the site is a walk-in well stairwell from one of the plazas in what Tepeso, who excavated the site, called the House of the Well. And just in this stairwell itself, there were instances of shell trumpets and shell that had been inlaid with turquoise and copper artifacts and objects like this axe head that you can see here on the left, that really you do not see anywhere else in the Southwest or even in West Mexico at this time, right? So some pretty incredible instances of objects and materials. Um, and then more broadly at the site, you also see immense collections of rare and exotic materials, hundreds of copper ornaments and turquoise pieces. You see millions of pieces of marine shell, even though, Paquimé is in this inland part of northwestern Mexico, Zacatecas, excuse me, Chihuahua. And then you also have an unprecedented macaw avicultural system with over 300 instances of scarlet macaws, 500 total macaws if you count military macaws. I think there were 81, and then 100 or more macaws that couldn't be identified to species. And I should also note, right, that there were also something like 400 or more turkeys being kept at the site too, right? And you can see these in the macaw pens, which are in the kind of the backdrop of this picture that I showed on this last slide. So really extensive evidence of materials and objects and things like that being brought from different places to Paquimé. And one of the things that archaeologists have been interested in is, right, we know that these objects circulated between regions, but how exactly did they move, right? What networks circulated these rare and non-local objects? What motivated their circulation? How did they come to be deposited in these different areas? And this was previously thought, I think there's a generation of archaeologists that went to work in northern Mexico, not only because of this, but certainly to understand a little bit better how did these objects move northward, right? Could they be found, these different kinds of objects we found at Chaco Canyon and Wapaki and different places in the Southwest, could they also be found at some of these North Mexican centers? and like Pakime, right, that has these massive amounts of objects. And what they found, and I think Ben Nelson helped put this slide together. He called this map on the left that Harbottle and Huygens produced here the greatest myth in North Mexican archaeology, because they were trying to understand how things may have been transported. But Ben has said to me, right, he went to go work at La Quemada and found actually really little evidence for the exchange of these rare and non-local objects elsewhere in North Mexico, right? And so maybe West Mexico is one of the areas that objects traveled through, certainly. And one of the other things that has kind of come out of this, or that people have done a little bit, is to this tendency to treat these distantly circulated objects as commodities. They're treated as objects that people go and get and bring and transport, right? And some of the newer perspectives that we have, certainly looking at scarlet macaws, is that perhaps it's they're not necessarily objects that you can just hand off to one person, right? And macaws are kind of an extreme example. And not only would they bite you and probably try to attack you if you weren't bonded to the bird, but even different pieces of copper objects and copper bells and shell trumpets and things like that. They're not just they're very powerful. They're powerful objects that come with kind of a suite of knowledge in order to use them properly, right? And maybe are not necessarily things that you could just hand off to another person to bring somewhere else. In the way that perhaps an economic interpretation, treating them like commodities might be interpreting. So, what are some of the models for understanding this long distance exchange, right? We have this Mesoamerican outpost idea that I talked about a little bit more previously, right? That these Pochteka tradespeople coming from Mesoamerica would have transported objects and materials northward by market, right? And this is really influenced by the Aztec market system, the Pachiteca class of traveling tradespeople, of course, and is something that we don't necessarily see. Again, as we're learning more and more, I think, about some of these sites and regions. We're thinking less, perhaps, that there were Mesoamerican outposts, and more, perhaps, right, that people were interested in specific classes of objects. And this has led Pat Gilman and other folks to draw on the work of Mary Helms and looking at the acquisition of ritually powerful objects and materials, going to areas that are unknown and mysterious, and coming back with specific objects. Pat uses the example of scarlet macaws in the story of the hero twins, right? That people would travel southward, procure scarlet macaws, and bring with the scarlet macaws this understanding of the hero twins mythology, um, from perhaps the Maya region, that they brought with them and then painted on pots in the Mimbres area, right? And certainly more and more, in looking at specific objects and their significance, I think that I'm personally drawing more on the idea of Mary Helms, right? That people could have been going long distances and then bringing back powerful objects with knowledge and an understanding of those objects that they might not be able to have by staying in the same place. And also, Michael Mathiowicz has talked a lot about the spread of the flower world complex and given a series of chats drawing on iconography, um, in this kind of expansive understanding of this flower world complex of objects and materials that traveled with people, as somewhat of a religious complex, northward and into the southwest from parts of Mexico, and Mesoamerica. And so then recently, one of the perspectives that we've taken, right, we've kind of started addressing these questions more broadly in the U.S. Southwest, um, specifically looking at copper bell, scarlet macaws, and shell trumpets, right? Vokes and Gregory did this, and more people have kind of taken this on. Jose Luis Punzo has talked a lot about copper bell networks, drawing on data and a network approach, which I'll get into a little bit more. I've looked at scarlet macaws. I'm not the only one, along with Pat Gilman, of course, and Steve Plog. And actually, we kind of have a flurry of people looking at shell trumpets. Sorry, shell trumpets, different kinds of shell and stuff like that right now in the Phoenix area, which has been kind of interesting too. So we're seeing an interesting revitalization. These are obviously not questions that have never been asked before, but an interesting revitalization, and looking at some of these, looking at objects, kind of an objects-based approach. Um, and as well as a network based approach, right? That's, I think, drawing some influence by the work that Matt Peoples and Barbara Mills and other folks working on Cyber Southwest, doing social network analysis of decorated ceramics to better understand what networks people drew on over time in the Southwest and how those networks changed over time too. So, and then again, Jose Luis Punso is now doing some interesting work. I was just at the Southwest Symposium where I got to see Jose Luis give a presentation on copper using a network approach to understand copper and how copper bells were being produced and transported over time, and that was pretty interesting as well. Now I'm going to dive deep into the Connections project and some of the work that we've been doing. I talked about these object-based approaches, and that's kind of exactly what drew Ben Nelson to start working on this. I think many years ago, I worked with him to sort of formalize our investigations and look a little bit more, or expand, I should say, bring on students and do a little bit more work to better understand long distance exchange. And what we wanted to do was to really understand the distributions of different distantly circulated objects, right? So where can they be procured, and then where do they end up, right? And so what we've done is tried to take just an object by object approach to understanding the context, where each of these different kinds of objects is found, how they're deposited, what is the depositional context of them, and then trying to understand, where an intrasite context, where within sites, and then an intersite context too, right? What different kinds of regions have macaws, or macaws, cacao, other kinds of materials, and how do those objects maybe move between these regions, if at all, right? What kinds of networks could connect them? And so we were interested in looking at a handful of different objects that I'm going to run through now. One of those is cacao, right? We've heard a lot about the cylindrical vessels found at Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon, from the work of Patty Crown and Jeff Hurst, specifically. And Patty Crown has continued this work with a book looking specifically at the deposition of these vessels, that has been really illuminating in better understanding them, right? We know that cacao itself originated or can be grown in the Maya region, as well as I think Michael Mathiowicz has also posited that it was transplanted into Nayarit in West Mexico. So it could have been as close by as West Mexico. We've looked at copper bells and other copper objects, and I just talked a little bit about some of the copper that's been found at Paquimé. Obviously, one of the areas where there's really extensive copper, and this is kind of a stylistic diagram from De Peso's work at Paquimé, looking at different types of copper bells that have been found throughout the Southwest, and all the way down into West Mexico and Central Mexico, right? And you see a lot of stylistic variation in these different regions. So certainly people have different styles that they're producing in different times and places. We've also collected information on iron pyrite mirrors. This is one example that was found at Maricopa Butte in Tempe, very close actually to where I'm presenting now, and kind of on the border of Mesa and Tempe. And iron pyrite mirrors you see them much more commonly in central Mexico or in the Maya region, that were worn as adornments by people, have many different representations and associations, right? And here are some more examples of reconstructions and repainted versions. We've also looked at shell bracelets and trumpets. Shell bracelets are kind of an interesting one, right? They're really ubiquitous throughout Phoenix and Tucson, and even up into Flagstaff. Really seem to be associated with people who would have identified. I'm not going to say identified as Hohokam, but certainly the people that Hohokam archaeologists are interested in understanding would have been wearing shell bracelets pretty much at all times. And so we've been trying to track and understand how expansive, how far these shell bracelets extended into Arizona and south into Sonora, if at all. And then shell trumpets, right, that could have come from the the Gulf of California, the Gulf of Mexico, the controversial Gulf of Mexico, and then in expanding all the way up into the west coast of what is now the United States, right, and off the coast of California. And so they have many different places that they're coming from, end up at archaeological sites in the Phoenix area, right? And here's an example from a site called La Ciudad. Stone pallets are another object that we're looking at. These are also pretty specific to Hohokam archaeological sites and different kinds of contexts. I know that we had early on kind of equated these with snuff pallets and tablets and things like that that come from Michoacan and Guerrero. There seems to be very different traditions, of course. And I actually wanted to show, we found this incredible. I'm starting to understand that there's so much variation in how these are produced. We found this incredible, really miniature pallet, perhaps the smallest I've ever seen anyway, on the ground when we were visiting Snaketown a couple of weeks ago too. So there's a ton of variation in how they're produced in different places and times. Now, scarlet macaws, obviously one of I think, one of the most interesting objects and materials that were transported. They have a natural habitat up to 1,500 kilometers to the south of the larger U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest. The closest area from which they could have been procured is Tamaulipas, present-day Tamaulipas, Mexico. And this stretches all the way south to the Yucatan and into Central America. There's been over 700 instances of scarlet macaws in the Southwest and Mexican Northwest, and I should say that 500 of those, right, are from Paquimé. So, really seem to be a ton of them there, but they do extend to the north and throughout the U.S. Southwest as you move northward. Um, and you can see the distribution here on the upper right part of the screen, and I'll talk a little bit more about scarlet macaws as we go. We look at turquoise, right? One of the objects and material types that had originally been hypothesized to have been transported south from the U.S. Southwest into parts of Mesoamerica and West Mexico. Here are a couple of different examples from Casa Grande in Arizona. And again, that's Harbottle and Weigand, when they were first doing this work, were really interested in sourcing turquoise, right? And trying to understand where these different turquoise sources were and where they came from. And I think they went to work really trying to better understand this, looking at some of these, and I want to show some of the fantastic examples of turquoise that have been found in Mexico. But I show these to show that there really aren't all that many examples of turquoise being found in some of the sites throughout Mesoamerica. There are some really incredible and impressive ones. But in terms of production locales and things like that throughout Mesoamerica, the evidence really hasn't been there. And one of the things that we're increasingly finding with the work of Alison Thibodeau, who's doing sourcing for some of these turquoise objects, is that they seem to have been found from at least the signatures that she's looking at, the isotopic signatures that she's looking at in these items, seem to have been found from more local locales within Mexico, and not necessarily from matching turquoise signatures from the Southwest. So I worked with a graduate student who went on to go do her own work, Lindsay Shepard, and some colleagues to work on a paper that looked at kind of the differences in turquoise mosaics found in the U.S. Southwest, specifically in Canal System 2 in the Phoenix area, and the differences that they have from these Mesoamerican mosaics, arguing that they really do seem to be produced locally, in that area. And again, this is, I think, corroborating in some ways the work that Alison Thibodeau has been doing on sourcing some of these. Now, I also want to say that these objects that we're looking at are not the only things that are circulated, right? Language, maize agriculture, ideas, different kinds of ideas are also circulated over long distances too, at a much broader scale. Um, and I think it's much harder to track this, right? I've talked about the arguments that Pat Gilman and colleagues were making about the hero twins being brought up into the Mimbres area. Um, Hayes, Gilpin, and Hale have also talked about the flower world, right, and how it's represented in different kinds of ceramic iconography throughout the Southwest, right? But you see different things like the feathered horned serpent, the hero twins, flower world being depicted over really, really broad expanses of time and space, and something that certainly would have been informing people's thinking about the world at a much broader scale, I think. Maybe more difficult for archaeologists to kind of drill down into. And then there were some, I don't want to say mundane because I find fish to be very interesting, but certainly more diarian, day-to-life instances of objects and materials that were transported over long distance as well. And I always point to this great Jet and Moyle article looking at fish that were depicted on Mimbres Classic period pottery. And they saw various different instances of fish that probably originated around the Guaymas area in the Gulf of California, which I always find is a really kind of a fun example and maybe something you don't really think about quite so much. And so what we did was we tried to better understand that by looking at some of the routes that people might have taken to understand that there. And you're looking at kind of a least cost path, stylistic least cost path analysis that we did to understand maybe how people were going and transporting those objects. It's in the past. So that's kind of the range of different things that we're thinking about and talking about. But and we also see examples of things like cotton textiles, fibers, tobacco, tropical fruits and vegetables, dried fish, shrimp, honey, beeswax, and stuff that Kelly had noted in an article that Aztlan traders were moving between West Mexico and perhaps to the north also. Now, I want to again draw a really important distinction in thinking about these objects more broadly that I'm going to give an example of to help better understand that, right? Ben Nelson calls some of these objects interaction markers, and what he defines that as are objects that are requiring direct transport from Mesoamerica or West Mexico into the Southwest. And those are things like cacao, like scarlet macaws, perhaps shell bracelets and trumpets as well, versus objects and ideas that could be local interpretations that people may have been based on a distant concept or something that they had seen in other places, but could have been recreated locally, right? And these are things like ball courts, the feathered serpent, instances of the feathered serpent, right, or stone pallets, something that people were probably producing in a little more local context. And this is important for understanding things like, cacao and chocolate drink and how people internalize and come to use these objects. So I think cacao is a particularly interesting example. Now, we see evidence for the importation of Theobroma cacao from southeastern Mexico or Central America, perhaps, or maybe West Mexico, as Michael Mathiowicz had talked about. Um, and the consumption of this drink, as Crown and others have argued, right, it reinforced status and authority over elite individuals through association with the psychoactive properties of cacao, as well as this broad distance of acquisition, right, that going over this long distance and acquiring it would have also symbolized kind of that power. And at Chaco Canyon, we see, interestingly, this ritual termination of cacao vessels in room 28 of Pueblo Bonito, right? So these were vessels that people were using that very clearly similar to the ones that we see in the Maya region, consuming this chocolate drink. And then when they were no longer being used, we see them terminated in a very, very specific context in room 28 at Pueblo Bonito, where they were all deposited in the single room and then closed in as if not to be used anymore, that this ritual, this practice will be terminated and no longer used. Um, Now, we see additional evidence of cacao cultivation and use in West Mexico more recently, and here's some of the examples of cacao vessels that Michael Mathiowicz has documented. And what he argues, and I think what other people have argued, is that despite these great distances, cacao and the cylindrical jars specifically appear to be adopted as part of this ritual suite of practices, right? It dates as early as 1500 in Mesoamerica and continued and continues, right? It has a much broader extension that continues today, but with it came, right, the production of these cylindrical vessels, the preparation of cacao in a very specific way of pouring from vessel to vessel and to create this frothy beverage. And kind of the wholesale adoption of a complex that was associated with this ritual beverage, perhaps status as well, and a hierarchy, right? That's evidenced by, their specific use at Pueblo Bonito and deposition and termination. Now, I'd like to kind of draw a contrast between that and scarlet macaws, because, right, we have evidence of scarlet macaws being brought from Mesoamerica, and you can see the distribution down here again on the right. They have many ritual associations in Mesoamerica. They're associated with sun, fire, elites, rulership. But when we look at instances of scarlet macaws being deposited, whether sacrificial, whether, whatever kind of context, they're actually incredibly rare. And I think we've managed to document something like 25 instances of scarlet macaws being deposited at Mesoamerican sites, right? And what we found are some dedicatory offerings at Copan, Tenochtitlan, a single macaw bone from a site called Hotocan in the northern basin of Mexico, where Chris Morehart has done some pretty extensive work. And a couple instances of macaws at a site called Vista Hermosa in Tamaulipas, a post-classic site that's right up at the very northern end of the distribution of these birds. We also see military macaws in a couple different contexts at Tierras Largas, which appears to have been a dedicatory kind of offering. And then again later, much later at Cueva de Avendaños in Chihuahua, right, which is actually the earliest instance of a macaw, whether military or scarlet, to be found in the Southwest and Northwest, U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest. So these representations of scarlet macaws, however, and I wanted to show while I'm here an image of a military macaw, which also has, really, really bright iridescent feathers. In blue and as well as in red too, right? So another bird that could have been and was really important to people. Um, we see representations of scarlet macaws are much more widespread. We see shaft tomb figurines in Colima, Michoacan, Jalisco. We see stone sculptures. One example at Copan, associated with the ball court, one of the central ball courts there. We see mural paintings at Teotihuacan, which I think are probably parrots or maybe even eagles. Don't necessarily appear to be red macaws, but and here are some other examples, right? From the codices, and again, some of the examples of how they've been depicted on pottery and these sculptures and in the clay, as well as even in the Matricula de Tributos, right, depicting red macaw feathers being traded amongst people. But we really do not see that backed up with the deposition of these birds throughout Mesoamerica. And this is very, very different from what we're seeing in the US Southwest, where we have instances of scarlet macaws being deposited at sites throughout this area, right? Not just at Paquimé, where there were 500, but in the times predating Paquimé as well, right? And on the left, you can see the pre-1250 distribution of scarlet macaws, the Chaco area and the Flagstaff area throughout southern Arizona, as well as the Mimbres area. And then the post 1250 distribution, where the locations of some of these birds change for sure as regions become depopulated, um, but a lot of them actually predate what we're seeing at Paquimé, right? And so it wasn't necessarily this one site that was influencing it. But looking at it more broadly, we really don't see a clear complex of ideas or practices, right? Just kind of a similarity of broad cosmological expressions, and this manifests in really local interpretations, the different treatments that we see throughout the US Southwest and Mexican Northwest. At Chaco, at Pueblo Bonito specifically, we find um, really full burials of birds that were deposited as complete birds that were probably cared for, and up to 12 birds that were found in a room that was described as archaeologists as an aviary, where these birds might have been kept together, and these birds had basically fallen and deposited in bird guano at the bottom of the room. And this kind of changes over time. In the Flagstaff areas, we see birds and humans kind of being given similar practices and treatments and burial, but perhaps not in the kind of really carefully deposited context that we see at Chaco Canyon. And then, of course, by the time you get to Paquimé, right, you see birds just spread throughout the site, deposited in all different kinds of contexts. Really ubiquitous in all different kinds of rooms, not restricted in the same way you see them in the Chaco area, um, or at Pueblo Bonito specifically. And then interestingly, throughout southern Arizona, right, these birds really aren't associated with some of the regional centers that like they are at Pueblo Bonito and Wapaki and Paquimé. They're kind of distributed at various different sites, very few quantities of birds, one or two, and very rare sites. So really different treatments over time. We really don't see any kinds of Mesoamerican practices associated with the birds specifically. From an archaeological perspective, they don't, and those practices really don't seem to be widely adopted over time and space. And interestingly, right, we're seeing from a genetics perspective, looking at the DNA in these birds, that at least for Chaco and Mimbres and parts of southern Arizona, these birds were probably bred in perhaps the U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest, but they're also, many of them are so closely related that's suggestive of a founding population of scarlet macaws, two founding birds, right, from which the rest of the birds in the Southwest were genetically related to, right? So this familiarity with the birds may have actually been removed from Mesoamerica proper, right? So the instances of people interacting with these birds could have ranged from like, you can see the birds and interact with them as they fly down and perhaps get food or something like that at your house, versus up in the Southwest, Northwest, outside of the natural range of these birds, you have people that were keeping them, right? Living their day to day, maintaining these birds, feeding them and interacting with them in perhaps very different ways than people in Mesoamerica. And broadly, there have been some interesting articles published as well about the significance of scarlet macaws throughout even Central America and into South America too. We see macaws transported from Amazonian rainforests to the Atacama Desert in Chile. You see feathers as markers of social, religious, and political status, and even the keeping of mummified birds, right? That demonstrated different burials. The birds appear to have been arranged in very specific ways, which is kind of interesting. It's in a very interesting parallel, perhaps, to what we're seeing in the U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest, although, of course, not exactly the same, right? As the more we're looking into it, the more we're finding that scarlet macaws are really integral to some of the origin stories and traditional histories, discussions of clan migrations at Hopi, Zuni, and even Navajo. There are different stories about macaws. We see macaw and parrot clans kind of spread throughout the different pueblos in the Southwest and in parts that are not pueblos, right? In the southern part of the Southwest, we have macaws as really important in autumn songs, and stories that are passed down. There's a whole song series dedicated to them, and we're kind of working to understand that a little bit better in my day to day. And um, not only were these birds kept in as early as 600 in the U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest through right 1400, 1500, we see that they were continued to be kept, right? We see them at various different pueblos throughout the northern Southwest as late as the early 19th century. Um, Actually, Neil Judd, who worked at Pueblo Bonito, had said that that gave a macaw, scarlet macaw, to the folks at Zuni in the 1930s, late 1920s, and as by 1939, that bird was still alive, albeit missing many, many of its feathers. Um, and had been thoroughly plucked. But it was reported that that bird had learned the names of many of the different elders, and could respond to people in Zuni and was communicating with people, right? Which is really really interesting. We see that these macaw feathers were essential elements of dances and ceremonies and attire. Prayer sticks used in different ways, of course, over time and space. And through the work of Octavius Siotua, a traditional knowledge keeper and Zuni archaeologist, who contributed a chapter to Birds of the Sun, he talked about the significance of macaws for Zuni people, right? That they are to be treated as relatives of the family upon death, that they are given similar burial treatments to humans. They're buried in very specific ways, and they're also buried in very specific places, right? They have a specific place where macaws are laid to rest, apart from humans, but right, that follows from, I think, their significance to people, right? And these kind of interactions, treating macaws as family members, are very different, right, than what we might understand from what we've seen in Mesoamerica. So it certainly seems to have established a different way of interacting with these birds and different treatments for them. So this is a hopeful map that we as a team had kind of put together in trying to understand some of these different objects and materials as they extend southward to the north. And our hope, I think, was always to fill this in with the actual material evidence of all of these different kinds of objects in different times and places. So this is something that we're working on, albeit slowly at the moment, but something that we're kind of constantly doing. One Some of the current projects that we're talking about and thinking about is trying to better understand the local contextualization of rare and non-local objects, especially scarlet macaws for me. And one of the things that that has really not necessarily been an offshoot of the work that we're doing, but in working with different tribes and pueblos and tribal nations throughout the Southwest, what we found is that there's actually a ton of interest in scarlet macaws and kind of trying to pair the archaeological understanding with contemporary understanding of these birds. So I've been working with the folks at Hopi with Stewart, and the Hopi Cultural Kuyimtawa and the Hopi Cultural Resource Advisory Team there, to better understand the current contemporary significance of scarlet macaws. Um, I'm also now working on trying to better understand how scarlet macaws are important to Optum communities as well, in the Phoenix area, although that's kind of in its infancy. But yeah, I've had some really good conversations about that too. Um, Network approaches, right, are another area where we've seen a really uh, broad development of social network analysis and different kinds of network approaches. And when we have all this these data, I guess we'll call it instances of different objects throughout the Mesoamerica and the Southwest, we can start to look at, how are they connected to one another? How does that change over time? And so right now, this is something we're really interested in, is in how can we draw on these network approaches to understand copper, specifically copper bells. And this work is being kind of continued by Jose Luis Punso, some of his collaborators and students. And then one of the things that the group were really interested in doing is filling in this picture for Sonora and Chihuahua. Trying to figure out what the data is. These areas are so critical to understanding, this trade, ideas of trade and exchange, and yet it's quite challenging to get to some of those data too, and trying to mine those gray reports in literature, and so, folks have been really really helpful who work there. I'm thinking of Randy McGuire and Elisa Villalpando, and having some of those conversations and drawing on some of the work that they've been doing there. Um, for long periods of time. So I also want to say, if you're interested in these topics, there are books out there for you. Flower Worlds is a really nice volume by Michael Mathiowicz and Andrew Turner. I talked a little bit about it today, and obviously Birds of the Sun, another great one if you're interested in looking and thinking more about scarlet macaws. And that's what all that I have for you today. So I want to obviously give thank you to everyone who's been involved in this work and helping this happen. So many different people. None of this work has happened in isolation. So um, thanks to all these different folks. And I would love to answer questions if there are people out there that have them.
That was great, Dr. Schwartz. I don't know if you can see the Q&A over here. I can read it to you.
Let's see.
Henry asks, where did they get the rubber and how was it processed into a ball?
Oh my gosh, that is a great question. Um, I do not know the practice all that well with the rubber itself. One of the things I'll say is that it's my understanding that there's really only been that single instance of a rubber ball found in the north, I should say, of like, Mesoamerica proper. So there aren't a ton of examples of rubber balls. What they do find are stones, a lot of stones, and these circular stone balls could have either been the core of the rubber balls that kind of degraded over time and weren't perfectly preserved, or people could have been playing with stone balls instead, perhaps, or put reeds and other kinds of things, wrapped fiber around them in different kinds of ways. So I really don't know. That's a very good question, and I'm sorry to say kind of ominous that I couldn't tell you the answer to that very first one, but yeah, that's not one I know very well.
I don't know if it's ever been considered, but when I've gone to Southeast Asia, I noticed that they do a ball made out of wicker in a game called
Oh yeah,
Takraw.
yeah, that's a good. And again, I was trying to think. One of the things I'm always kind of like, okay, well, in the Southwest, we don't have a lot of instances of rubber balls. We have we have these courts that were, may have been used to play a ball game, may have been used for dances and things like that. Could have been used as marketplaces, and all these things could interdigitate, right? They can all be kind of the same. And so yeah, it's like I'm always kind of trying to think of like, where's the evidence pointing me? But and obviously, right, what do people say? What do Autumn people say today about it too? So it's a good question.
Uh, MRG asks regarding Holcomb Ball Court. One photo you show indicates a very narrow passage for one person to go into the ball court.
Mhm.
Any clues why this passage is so narrow?
Yeah, you're probably referencing the image from Wapatki, and this is, there's a lot of stylistic differences that happen in how these ball courts are prepared, maybe related to how people are playing the game in different areas, or what kinds of activities they're doing within them. Um, One of the things we also have a good idea of is that these events would have been, regardless of what people are doing, they would have been important events, right, for building cohesion in a community, for bringing people together. And so, there could have been processions and things like that that happened, and the entrance into these places um, could have been something that was a really important event for people and would have been done in these very prescribed ways. And so I suspect it could be related to that, how people would enter the court, how it would have been used, and so on.
Henry asks, many of the trade routes on your map do not seem to follow water river ways.
Yeah, some of them do, some of them do not, and some of them will kind of take people from one river system to another. Is one thing I would say, right? As people are going, especially into the Gulf, you can kind of jump from area to area. People would have needed to follow waterways, but again, one of the other things I would say is that the I think that Vokes and Gregory did a great job in kind of trying to better understand where those routes may have been, but um, they're kind of broad overviews for understanding that. They're not necessarily like specific trail maps that people had and stuff like that. But I do know that people who travel on these very, very long distances to go and procure objects and do different kinds of things will have a really solid understanding and will oftentimes mark different areas with rock art, with songs and things like that, so that people know where to go, how to get to different places, and where they can access water from seeps and streams and at different times of year and so on.
It looks like the Phoenix area isn't all that far from the Gulf of California.
No, no. Well, I guess far is a
Walking.
depends on how you define far. But
Yeah.
no, people today, I mean, O'odham communities and other communities throughout the Southwest today still will go down and travel by foot
Mhm.
to different places at different times of year for different ceremonies and to be with different community members. And so it's very much manageable for these communities and has been for very long times.
MRG asks, shell bracelets appear to be too small for the average hand. Was there the possibility of attached to clothing?
Maybe. Most shell bracelets, I think, appear to be a lot of the ones I've seen appear to be about the size that someone would wear on their arm or on their wrist. Maybe there are smaller ones out there too, shell rings and things like that that people could have worn in different ways as well. So different kinds of variations, I think.
Henry asks, what psychoactive properties are associated with cacao besides caffeine?
Oh, besides caffeine, I don't actually know the answer to that. How crazy psychoactive. I was thinking mostly with caffeine and how caffeine can affect you in different kinds of ways. I suppose if you take a lot of it at any given time, that would be, or you can also mix things into it too. But yeah, I don't know exactly what they would be other than the caffeine.
Henry asks, if you pull the feathers off a macaw, will they grow back?
They will grow back. Yeah, scarlet macaws produce feathers and molt at regular times of the year, right? So, um, this is a conversation that's been had. A lot of the scarlet macaws that have been found, almost all of the scarlet macaws that have been found in the Southwest and Mexican Northwest appear to have died between 10 and 12 months of age. And initially, I think people thought, well, maybe that's when they grow these long tail feathers, right? So people are after those big red tail feathers. And as we looked into that more and more, the truth is that they really start to grow those tail feathers around 3 to 6 months. And by 6 months, they fully develop those tail feathers. So if the birds don't need to be totally plucked because they will actually continue to grow feathers and molt feathers over time, as long as you're patient and able to keep those birds healthy. If they experience dietary challenges and things like that, they will start to drop feathers and not necessarily grow them back because they're unhealthy and not particularly happy. And so, yeah, there's a lot of conversations there about that, but they will grow back. I don't necessarily believe that the feathers or the birds in the Southwest would have produced a lot of feathers for people if they were being kept in some of the contexts we know that they were deposited in. So.
Ed and Brina ask, is there any evidence of protection or the need to protect from thieves when transporting goods?
This is a great question. I looked into this because I wanted to understand what this process would have been like of transporting objects and materials over distances. If you look at the Pochteca class of traders from Aztec times, they, well, two things. They travel armed, so they went with guards and people who could protect them. But it's also my understanding that they enjoyed a really protected class. And status. And so if you were to attack a tradesperson, you were inviting war, with the Aztec Empire, basically, because, they're meant to go out there and travel and trade. And so there was the might of the Aztec Empire behind them, which deterred, I think, people from messing with them, attacking them, and so on. If you were a pioneering US Southwestern person traveling hundreds of kilometers to the south, you may not have enjoyed that same protection, I would think. And so, yes, this could have been a really dangerous route. Now, you would have been traveling through people who shared a similar linguistic dialect, linguistic roots, perhaps not the same, um, but communities that would have been organized in ways that were not dissimilar to your community as well, um, and people um, who you perhaps could have communicated with and stayed with or traveled with. You could have family or other parts of people who you knew through different kinds of trade connections or through movement on the landscape. I also think that in the past more broadly, people were much more highly mobile, I think, than we give them, or we as archaeologists are willing to give them credit for. And I don't think that's because we as archaeologists hate mobility or anything like that, but it's really tough um, to document these things. The archaeological record is by necessity stagnant for us, and so trying to understand how people moved on the landscape introduces a lot of challenges in how we're interpreting the past too. So. Um, so yeah, I'll use an Otham example, right? There's songs and different kinds of oral traditions associated with traveling to different places and movement on the landscape, on these really over broad distances. There are also Otham communities that extend from Phoenix all the way down to the Tejano Otham Reservation into the south and parts of Sonora, right? All along the route that perhaps people would have gone down to procure shell bracelets or the shell glosimerus that they made shell bracelets out of. Um, so yeah, this is, that's it certainly would have been dangerous, I think. I think traveling long distance would have been dangerous, but I think there also would have been kind of mitigating factors that would have helped people in their travels.
It must be difficult too to identify some of the trade route because it's on the coast and a lot of weather related erosion and whatnot to find what happened there, hundreds or thousands of years ago.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's actually incredible. Some of these prehistoric trails will pop out at you when you're working somewhere like South Mountain,
Mhm.
where people, have been traveling on landscapes. And I've worked all through Southern Arizona and found instances of these trails, which is shocking. You'd think that these places would be weathered, but there are definitely some routes that have escaped modern development in those areas. So you can see evidence of them when you're out there.
Josh and Kyle ask, has there been any research suggesting ties to contemporaneous sites in the state of Guanajuato, such as Peralata,
Peralta, yeah.
Islas, and La Canada de Virgen?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know that I would know to that degree. What I would say that we have observed in looking much more broadly is that there are synchronicities, I think, in the outward expansion of Mesoamerica or the northward expansion of Mesoamerica and the adoption or acquisition of some of these objects and materials that we're seeing in the Southwest. So to describe that a little bit further, I don't think is a coincidence at all that from 600 to 900 you see the northward expansion of people out of like Teotihuacan in that area into the north. You see Tula, you see places like La Quemada Alta Vista all the way along the Sierras. And then around 600, 700, we also see scarlet macaws for the first time in the Phoenix area. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think people are expanding northward in that way, and with that northward expansion comes, people moving north and north and north, and perhaps establishing connections that they may not have had. Um, by 900, there's scarlet macaws and copper bells throughout the entirety of the Southwest, right? In the Mimbres region, up in Chaco, and again, you kind of see a larger changes in Mesoamerica at that time. A lot of these large, Chaco Canyon around 1150. The Mimbres region around 1150, people start to depopulate or at least reorganize. I wouldn't say fully depopulate or anything like that. Um, but you kind of see these regional reorganization happening as well in Mexico. You see the start of the post-classic period. And with that comes the huge broad expansion of Aztlan tradition and people in West Mexico up the north coast and up the coast. And again, then you start to see Scarlet Macaws end up at Paquimé and as well throughout parts of the Southwest after 1250. So what I would love to do is like if the more dates we can get from these birds. I have mixed feelings about just doing additional destructive analysis on Scarlet Macaws. The work that I did personally, I did in collaboration or in consultation, I shouldn't say collaboration, with the Hopi tribe and to answer a very specific question. But what would be incredible someday, right, would be to, and again, through a process by which, people are being consulted on this thing, tribes specifically, we could get dates or if some non-destructive means of sampling for C14 comes along, we could get dates for all of these birds and then know exactly, or at least more closely, what they date to and how that might mesh with some of the larger developments that we're seeing happen in Mesoamerica and West Mexico.
L asks, there were actually two rubber balls found at Holcomb site near Toltec, Arizona, but one was given away before Emil Curie reported
Howdy.
on one that was given to a museum. The
Oh,
one
cool.
examined and published was made from latex from a plant called guayule,
Mhm.
not from true rubber.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Al. That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't. It's been a while since I've read the article about it, so that's a good reminder.
Mhm. Uh, Elaine Scheidel asks, fascinating presentation. Since the lowlands of Mesoamerica America are so very wet and consequently the burials are wet, is it possible that any trace of macaw feathers would have deteriorated so that there was no trace?
Yeah, it is totally possible. That is exactly right. Um, they deteriorated almost entirely, all of them. There are so few examples of macaw feathers, although there is one incredible example from the edge of the Cedars Museum of a macaw feather garment that preserved perfectly, red and blue feathers. It looks like what we might today call an apron, although I don't want to, it could have been worn in a different way, so I don't want to suggest that it perhaps is the same thing. But yeah, the feathers themselves would have been totally destroyed and would not have preserved. But and the skeletons would have, right? So we know that the bird skeletons are going to be much more easy to study for that reason. But one of the things I usually try to make clear in presentations is that the feathers could have traveled much more widely than the birds themselves, right? There could have been thousands of macaw feathers at every archaeological site in the Southwest for all that we that I know about it personally. But I do think there were probably feathers traveling much more widely than the birds.
El
Oh, and
comment.
Al's got us here with the Theobroma too.
Yeah. So yeah, besides caffeine, the
Yes.
primary stimulant in chocolate besides cacao, besides caffeine is how you say theobromine.
Yeah,
Um,
theobromine, which is the one that they're testing for, that they're interested in understanding better. Milder and longer lasting effect, component of the so-called black drink used in the Southeast. Oh, cool. So it has ties throughout the country.
mhm.
Well, our present day country.
Henry says, yeah, thank you so much for the great talk and for your research. Elaine comments, let's see here. Uh, the Maya made rubber balls by bleeding rubber plants and then mixed it with other plant fibers and rolled
Yep.
it into a ball.
Yeah, that sounds about right. That would be my understanding. And I would guess that's what you would find people doing up in the Southwest as well. And that's why I was thinking that, you could totally roll those stone balls that we find, right, could have been rolled with plant fibers and things like that.
And then Roger comments, I'm going to probably butcher these words. FYI, there's a Arizona plant called guayule shrub,
Mhm.
Corinthium argentatum, that produces a rubber-like material.
Good to know.
Great. Any other questions? If anybody, oh, I see a hand up from Anne. Let's see if, oh, unmute, Anne. You are muted.
I hesitate to ask this, but have you, I sort of guessing you've probably been in on some discussions also with some of these things migrating into the American Eastern um, areas and the Eastern complex and up to Cahokia with the platform mounds and all of that. And do you have a take on what that discussion might be at this point?
No, I haven't thought too much about that. I haven't really, I think, gone on the deep dive of the literature in the Southeast and the East and Midwest that I probably need to on there. So I'm hesitant to make any broad sweeping statements that could could be interpreted the wrong way. Um, but I mean, some of these objects and materials and right things used to produce these drinks were obviously really important to people and had really important effects that were used in very particular and specific ways. And so I don't think it's particularly surprising that over thousands of years people would have learned about and understood things to that level and could have come to, you know, even if things maybe appear similar over great distances, they could have come to similar uses and things like that. But I certainly, given the name of the talk, right? Even I'm on the end that I like to believe that people were really kind of communicating with one another and and passing these objects and materials and knowledge and things like that on through some of those interactions, whether they be, people physical face to face or objects and ideas traveling through networks of information.
Because through the Midwest, there's certainly
Yeah.
different materials, but they're huge networks of obsidians and
Hmm.
galena and copper and those items and shell from the Gulf Coast moving all
Yeah.
through the areas. So
Yeah.
not exactly the same, but certainly quite a few similarities and aspects
Yeah.
of what we're seeing.
Yeah, and to that, I would say one of the things I've really tried to get across in the presentations I've given and papers that I've written on these things is that I think that we as archaeologists, well, I don't want to say paint us all with the same brush, right? But I think there is a tendency sometimes to adopt somewhat um, non-dynamic views of how objects were traveled, transported in the past, or to say that, this was transported through down the line exchange, this was transported through markets or something. And I think the truth of it is probably that there were, various different types of moving an object on a landscape could have happened for the same object. Some objects, like scarlet macaws, I think would have required people to carry over really long distances. Other objects could have been transported in different ways, but some of them may have been important enough that someone would have had to carry it, like a shelled trumpet or something like that, too. Um, so I'm really trying to get across that I think there's a lot more complexity than perhaps archaeologists have really wanted to give to some of the transport of some of these objects. And this is something that's recognized in the anthropological literature on exchange and trade, but maybe not something that we've yet fully adopted as archaeologists as we're talking about it. And again, some of that's because we as archaeologists are following the material evidence, and where the material evidence is, we follow, and have to draw our arguments from that. So,
Roger comments that edge of the Cedar Museum in Blanding, Utah, has a full macaw feather garment.
yeah, that's the one I referenced just a little bit earlier. It's incredible. If anyone ever has a chance to see it, it is just really remarkable. Red macaw feathers all kind of organized in this linear, wrapped around these different threads of fiber, and yeah, with a little bit of blue right in the middle too. It's really incredible.
Any additional questions? Anyone feel like talking? I'll unmute you. Let's see. Oh, Anne?
I guess I'm going to ask for a little bit of clarification, and that
Sure.
is that you were talking about the DNA of the macaws, and it looked like there might be like a founding couple or a few who led to a lot of the numbers in the Southwest. So does that speak? And maybe you said something on this during the talk, but I was sort of taking in a lot. Does that maybe speak to that there wasn't as much transport of the actual birds from the southern areas up into the Southwest?
That's kind of what how I'm understanding it.
Okay.
I guess for me, one of the things that kind of came up as this research was kind of unfolding was that these relationships between people and birds are not, they're really deeply rooted. To the point where, like, if you look at the Zuni origin stories, right, you have macaws playing a really central role in some of those, in at least one of those stories. And so they date they date really far back in archaeological time. The people were interacting with those birds since, the as you hear it from the Zunis, right? These points of creation, right, where they became Zuni people, macaws figure into those different kinds of traditions and stories. And so it's it seems to me that would happen through this really, really long-term interaction of people. Now, Hopi, for instance, has stories of clan migrations, people moving all over the landscape, perhaps, and also people coming from the south, all the way in Mesoamerica, groups of people coming from there to meet and become modern day Hopi people too, and bringing with them objects and materials. Among those, macaws could have been one of the things. But what we're finding on the archaeological side, looking at kind of these analytical techniques, is really that people seem to be raising the birds locally, within the sites that they're being found at, and they also seem to be, right, so closely genetically related that there either is a founding population of birds that was bred in the Southwest, Mexican Northwest, or people were continuously traveling to the exact same spot on the landscape to procure birds from the same founding bird pair. So either of those things is possible, but right, people could have been going to one specific place, procuring the birds, bringing them back up, and then moving them on from that point. Um, but I think it's totally believable to think that there could have been people breeding birds in the Southwest at this time where people went to get those birds. Now, I this is something that even today, right? I don't think that would need to leave a really big um a footprint on the landscape or an archaeological footprint, because there are families of bird breeders, and certainly into historic times, we have historic references talking about these pajareros, families of bird breeders that kept birds, specific different kinds of birds that people could go to get to procure birds. And so I think it could have been a small scale in operation as that just extended over many, many years, or families of people that were breeding these birds. I don't necessarily think that a pioneering family needed to travel right from Chaco to Wapaki to Southern Arizona to Pacquiao, to get to that same kind of thing. But yeah, I certainly do think that there could have been people somewhere in that intermediate area between the natural distribution of the macaws, and the Southwest, where they could have been going to get the birds. I know that Michael Mathiowicz has given recently an interesting talk that I haven't seen all of, but I'm in the process of checking out, looking at West Mexico as an area where maybe there were scarlet macaws and other kinds of birds being kept in West Mexico that people were going down to get. And I think, honestly, to me, that seems like the simplest solution, because there were these extensive connections between people living in the Southwest and West Mexico too. So yeah, there's all kinds of different possibilities. We're trying to follow the data that we have in front of us, right?
Yeah.
The genetic data without going too far. But yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's important too.
Wonderful. Any additional questions before we say goodbye to our esteemed guest? All right. Let me share our webpage over here. So if you liked what you saw today, I highly recommend that you become a member or renew your membership. It's very affordable, and you get great things like, you're supporting meetings like this. You also get the Codex, our newsletter, and you become a member of another group, the IAAA, the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. So we count on your support. Here's the website for the IAAA. They also have events and chapters throughout Illinois. And hope you come back for our next meeting, which will be about ancient Peru. So at our next meeting, it's not going to just be Zoom. It's also going to be in person. We're going to be at the Evanston Public Library. I hope you come by on April 27th. Come by about 2 o'clock, start at 2:30. And I see Anne has some comments.
Well, one, I was going to make sure we mentioned the April 27th meeting. And two, we use a email program that I've got set up so that one, there's a section which I can distribute just to our membership. And then I've got another section, they're actually combined and you do a sort on them, but that if people in other areas want to be informed on upcoming talks and some of those, that you can have we really, our service and what we do depend on membership. But we know that a lot of people have other affiliations also. But if you would like some monthly information on and Zoom links for our upcoming talks and things, and want to be on our site where we send out some periodic notices, then you could certainly go to our website and do that, or you can email me at awdanthro@aol.com.
And did you want to talk about the annual meeting for the IAAA?
Oh, Dale, I'll turn.
Yeah, Dr. Schwartz, thank you very much for that presentation. Very thorough. Was it really impressive to see the sort of the amount of material culture that you guys and biological evidence you're looking at. It's quite overwhelming, but I think that in that you're able to come up with a lot of outstanding models to test as you're moving forward, especially with sort of network analysis and SNA and all of these techniques that we're using more as archaeologists to look at that stuff. Most of my work's in the Pacific, where we've greatly used those models. John Terrell at the Field Museum, especially, and trying to trace different objects. Similar, I mean, we're going over water, which is a little bit different, but there's still some mechanisms in place. So thank you very much for that. I look forward to going back and reviewing it with some time.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all of you.
Cool. Just really quickly for our IAAA, we've got our meeting in almost less than a month, which is quite exciting. It'll be down in Robinson and Flat Rock, Illinois. On the webpage, you'll see on the IAAA page, you'll see just an outline of what chats are planned and activities. They're doing everything but looking doing actual research while we're there, looking at some of the early pioneer roads that came into Illinois from Indiana. There'll also be a French, Canadian, Indian sort of reenactment, which I think is quite exciting. And then all the fixins and food, which is always a good time. So if you'd like more information, it is free and open to the public. But as Anne had just mentioned, and I will as well, the membership that you give to CAS, you also gain membership to the IAAA. So you get two birds with one stone, two macaw feathers with one throw. And hopefully with that, you can enjoy a variety of Illinois archaeology. So please join.
Speaking of macaws, Elaine Scheidel mentions that we have had a blue gold macaw and have had her for 30 years. They're very hard to transport in that they would chew through wood and get very angry and in a bad mood.
Yeah, we did it. I worked on a chapter with Kelly Taylor, someone who's kept scarlet macaws in the Southwest for 30 years, and Michelle Hegman, where we kind of walked through what this process would have been like. And they are so non-compliant and challenging and would have just been awful to transport. Really, really difficult. And blue and golds are probably pretty similar to scarlet macaws, I would think. Although I know they all have individual personalities, but they're very non-compliant birds, would have been plucking at you. And especially if you're not bonded with that bird and don't have that relationship with the bird, which is not always something you can fabricate, it would have been a huge challenge, So.
If there's no further announcements, I'm going to call this meeting to a close. Thank you very much, Dr. Schwartz, for coming out. Thank you, everyone, for your very thoughtful questions, and hope to see you next month on Zoom or at the Evanston Public Library. Thank you.